gentlemen, thank you for coming, and I guess a little bit of an apology for such a packed house because it was just so popular. I squeezed as many chairs in as I could. But it's always great to see everybody here, a lot of friendly faces. I know a lot of you have been here before, and if you've been to some of our events, I'm sure you know John. He's, whether or not he's speaking or he's collecting donations for the friends or if he's just helping us out behind the scenes, he's always here, it seems like, helping us out and putting on these great programs for everyone. But it's always an extra special treat when John gives the program. It's kind of become a tradition every evacuation day for John to speak about something, specifically Washington Revolutionary War related with the site. John is the author of about 660 pages worth, I think, of information on slightly less than 9 months that General Washington was in headquarters here. So he's really added to the interpretation of the site as Washington's headquarters as well. He has a new book coming out this spring/summer sometime. The Road to Concord, how 4 cannons. Stolen cannons. The Revolutionary War. I thought I could memorize it. That was close. So we're excited about that. We unfortunately don't have it yet, of course, because it's not out. But this summer, stop back and see us, because I'm sure we'll have it in the visitor center if you want to pick up a little copy. But with that, help me welcome John Bell.
To everybody here at Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, thank you all for coming out and providing such a crowded room. So thank you. The end of Tory Row, this is the story about what happened in the big yellow mansion built along the road from Cambridge to Watertown just before the Revolution. And of course, I'm speaking of Elmwood. The house that's down on Elmwood Street. It's one end of Tory Row. That was what this neighborhood was eventually called. And this is talk about the first owner of that house, a man named Thomas Oliver. He was from a wealthy family in Dorchester. They gained their money from a slave labor plantation on the Caribbean island of Antigua. He was born on Antigua in 1734, and the family moved to Massachusetts when Thomas was 4. The Olivers were Anglican, so they saw the King of England as the head of their church. Their wealth depended on the British trading system, so they were natural friends of the royal government as opposed to the descendants of Puritans in New England who were always a bit suspicious of that central authority. Thomas Oliver went to Harvard, class in 1753. In 1760, he married a young woman named Elizabeth Vassall. Her family also got its money from Caribbean plantations, in this case on the island of Jamaica. Now, if you were a very rich Anglican in Massachusetts who wanted to marry within your class and religion, you really didn't have a lot of choices. So, as an example of this, 7 months later, Thomas's sister married Elizabeth's brother, John Bell. Thomas's sister was also named Elizabeth, which meant that Miss Elizabeth Vassall became Mrs. Elizabeth Oliver, and Miss Elizabeth Oliver became Mrs. Elizabeth. John Vassall took his bride to the mansion he had built in Cambridge, a big gray house with a very large estate down to the river and with fields and orchards and everything on every side. In 1770, we know that John Vassall paid more property taxes to the town of Cambridge than anyone else, so he had the biggest estate. And today, that house is even bigger, though the estate is smaller, and we know it as Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. Thomas and Elizabeth Oliver, living about a mile and a half away, must have enjoyed visiting the Vassalls. Oliver, in fact, gave money to build the new Anglican church here in Cambridge, and even had his first daughters baptized at this church while he wasn't yet living in Cambridge, but he was already putting down roots and ties to this community. And in 1766, he commissioned Elmwood in this neighborhood. It's just further out along the river road towards Watertown. It's often said to have been designed by Peter Harrison of Newport, but it was probably just a standard Georgian house plan. During the colonial revival, people like to say that every fine Georgian house was designed by Peter Harrison of Newport. He designed quite a number of them, but maybe this one, maybe not. We do know that a local housewright named John Nutting worked on the house And we know that Thomas Oliver ended up paying almost as much real estate tax as his brother-in-law. So he also had a very big estate with farmland and gardens and orchards. As you can see from this map printed in 1777, the Oliver's house was then on the main road to Watertown, which hugged the river. Today, Brattle Street cuts straight through to the gates of the Mount Auburn Cemetery, and Elmwood is on Elmwood Street. It's now a dead end. But back then, it was part of the main road. Another interesting thing about this neighborhood is that almost all the neighbors were Elizabeth Oliver's relatives. There was her fraternal aunt Susanna, who married the retired sea captain George Ruggles, and they lived in this handsome Georgian mansion. There was her maternal aunt, Rebecca Phipps, who married a local merchant and politician named Joseph Lee. They lived in this house. Lee had bought it up. This is an older house that Lee built in the late 1600s. Lee bought it and had it fixed up so it looked a bit more Georgian, but I don't think the proportions are quite right the way that some of the others do. Then closer to Cambridge, there was Elizabeth's maternal aunt Mary, who married the merchant Richard Leechmere. They lived in this house. It's been moved and altered, no longer in its original spot, but it's still along Brattle Street. Then came the houses of the estate of John and Elizabeth Bassel, where we're on, and a little bit closer to town, on the riverside of the road, was the house of Elizabeth's paternal uncle, Henry, and his wife, Penelope. Finally, elsewhere in Cambridge, Elizabeth's maternal uncle, David Phipps, lived with on his farm. He was the royal sheriff of Middlesex County, and very close to Harvard College was Elizabeth's paternal aunt, Anna, who married a merchant named John Borland, and they moved into this house in 1765. The Borland's house had been built for the Reverend East Apthorpe, the son of an immensely wealthy Boston merchant. Apthorpe's mother was even more wealthy because her money came from Caribbean sugar plantations. East Apthorpe went to England to study. He took holy orders in the Church of England, and he came back to be the first minister at Christ Church in Cambridge. Peter Harrison of Newport did send plans for this building. We know that. This is a Peter Harrison building. It opened for services in October 1761, and the local New England Congregationalists, the descendants of the Puritans, saw it as a direct affront, a direct challenge to their Harvard College. It was an attempt by the Church of England to put down a heavy footprint and exercise power in America. And then East Apthorpe went and he commissioned that very big house for himself, using his own money, mind you, but the Congregationalists said it was fancy enough to be a palace, a bishop's palace. And they put out all sorts of pamphlets and cartoons like this one, an attempt to land a bishop in America. And you can see that the locals are pushing away this boat and forcing the bishop back on. And eventually that controversy did in fact drive East Apthorpe away, and he decided he wasn't welcome in Cambridge, and he went back to England and found a comfortable living, as they said, and had a perfectly pleasant clerical career. Now, as I said, but the Christ Church of Cambridge remained. And as I said, Thomas Oliver and most of his neighbors and relatives supported that church. After moving to town, he became a vestryman and later a warden. Most of his neighbors were also Anglican, some of them even though they had started out in Congregationalist families. Thomas and Elizabeth eventually had 6 daughters. The Vassals, who were the other young family on the street, had a number of children as well, mostly boys. And we can imagine the cousins growing up together in the same neighborhood, sometimes playing together, sometimes separately. Baron Redhazel, who was a prisoner of war after the Battle of Saratoga, was housed in the house built for Richard Leechmere, and she heard about this pleasant life, and she wrote, 7 families who were connected with each other partly by the ties of relationship and partly by affection had here farms, gardens, and magnificent houses, and not far off plantations of fruit. The owners of these were in the habit of daily meeting each other in the afternoons, now at the house of one and now at the other, and making themselves merry with music and the dance, living in prosperity, united and happy. Now, of course, we have to remember that that lifestyle was based on slavery. Most of those large houses were staffed by enslaved domestic servants. Slaves worked the fields and the gardens and the orchards around them, and all the families were really living off the income from Caribbean sugar plantations, which were somewhere between work camps and death camps. the Caribbean planters knew that those tropical islands were unhealthy. In fact, that's why they started moving to Boston in the early 1700s, seeking a more healthy climate and more cultural opportunities for their children. John Vassall, we know, probably visited Jamaica to look over the family property of the young man. Thomas Oliver may have gone to Antigua for the same reason, but mostly they were just absentee owners, working through overseers and taking the money. After the Olivers moved in to the neighborhood along the Watertown Road, there were some changes in the neighborhood. In 1769, Henry Vassall died, leaving his wife Penelope a widow. Her daughter had married Dr. Charles Russell of Lincoln, moved out there. So over the next few years, it looks like Penelope's nephew John bought a lot of her property, both land and human property. And so the widow Vassall was doing more or less what we'd call downsizing. 2 years later, the Leachmeres sold their house to Jonathan Sewell. Jonathan Sewell was from the poor branch of a venerable Massachusetts family. He was a great friend of John Adams when they were both young lawyers. And Sewell married Esther Quincy from a merchant family. In the mid-1760s, Sewell wrote newspaper essays supporting the crown in the political controversies of the day. So in return, the royal governor made him the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and later he became a Vice Admiralty judge, which was another royal appointment as a reward for his political support. So when Sewell arrived on the Watertown Road, he was a poor boy who had made good, or possibly nouveau riche, but he was also from this old Massachusetts family. He was not an Anglican, but politically he fit in with all his neighbors who tended to support the crown. But those changes to this neighborhood were minor compared to what happened in 1774. Just before that year began, on December 16, 1773, Boston radicals destroyed 3 shiploads of tea. This was a protest and an attempt to stop the Imperial government's Tea Act, the latest attempt to raise revenue in the American colonies. Now that controversy really had no direct effect on the Olivers neighborhood, but on May 7, 1774, Bostonians destroyed another shipload of tea, the lesser-known Second Boston Tea Party. News of that event reached Parliament in London just as they were debating what to do about the first one. So they were in no mood to take any sort of lenient measures. The ministry in London made General Thomas Gage the new governor of Massachusetts. He was already the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. Gage promised the king personally that he would govern firmly, and in particular he was going to enforce the Boston Port Bill, which forbade all transatlantic traffic from Boston until the town repaid the cost of the destroyed tea. Gage arrived in Boston in May 1774, replacing the previous governor and bringing some army regiments to help him keep the peace. On London's orders, he also moved the legislature from Boston to Salem. Closing the port affected a lot of Boston merchants as well as a lot of workers. Again, it probably had a limited effect on the families out here because most of them got their wealth from other parts of the empire. As long as the islands were still producing sugar and somewhere in the empire there was a market for it, they didn't really need the port of Boston. The Massachusetts radicals, of course, protested the new law, and they voted to send delegates to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia to organize a continent-wide protest against the new law. General Gage tried to stop them, but he couldn't shut down the legislature in time. Meanwhile, there were reports already of Parliament working on an even stricter law, a law which would permanently change the Massachusetts government. Now here's part of the structure of the Massachusetts government. Part of it is top-down authority from the royal government in London, or the imperial government. Since 1692, the Crown had appointed the province's governor and lieutenant governor. Those men, or really the governor, appointed judges and sheriffs and other local officials. The London government controlled the military, the army and the navy. The London government controlled the customs office, which was the only way it was collecting money from people in Massachusetts. But the Massachusetts government also included bottom-up authority. It was organized around these small towns. And the voters in those towns. Now, since those voters, they were white men with enough property to be independent, it really wasn't the top, it really wasn't the bottom up, it was sort of the middle up. But I guess we'll call it the bottom up. The town meetings, elected selectmen and other town officials every year. The town meetings elected representatives to the Massachusetts legislature called the Massachusetts General Court. That legislature had two chambers, the House and the Council, and each year's outgoing House and Council elected the new Council. So the Council is made up of the very elite gentlemen who are supposed to advise the governor. Nevertheless, they got their authority from the bottom up, eventually being elected by people who had been elected by people who had been at town meetings. There were naturally a lot of areas of overlap and conflict in this system. For instance, the governor could negative or veto any councilor he didn't want to work with, but once he had a council, he couldn't do anything unless the council, he couldn't do certain things unless the council approved of that action. In the courts, the judges were top down, answering only to the king, but the juries were bottom up, and sometimes the juries would nullify what the judges had to say, and sometimes the judges would nullify what the juries had decided. And from the Stamp Act of 1765 on, London tried to strengthen its control over all its North American colonies, and the Americans, and especially the people here in Massachusetts, fought back with protests, boycotts, and occasional riots. Another important part of the government and society at the time were the militiamen. The militia was part of local self-government and self-defense. It was separate from the regular military, the Army and the Royal Navy. Militia service was required by law for almost all white men between the ages of 16 and 60. In New England, they elected their company officers. The governor tended to only have really approval of the generals, maybe the colonels from the top. But this was another area of combined bottom-up and top-down authority. Most important, if the militia didn't want to turn out, there was no way to get the militia to turn out. The governor realized this in the Knowles riot against Preston in 1747 and the Stamp Act riots in 1765. The governor would say, well, if people are rioting, let's call out the militia. And the advisors would all say, you see those men out there? Those are the militia. If you can find anyone who's willing to hit the drum and try to assemble, they're going to break the drum. It's not going to work. The militia was also a way for proving oneself, to climbing in society or confirming that one was already at the top of society. And in that regard, Thomas Oliver became an officer in the Middlesex County Militia Regiment. He was eventually a lieutenant colonel under his neighbor, General Williamrattle. And his vassal relatives also served as colonels for a while. I think they just sort of traded off the job. His uncle, David Phipps, commanded the governor's horse guard. It seems like sometimes the top officers' ranks would be reserved for the wealthiest man in the community, either as a mark of respect in this still very deferential society, or because he provided the best feasts on militia training days. Probably, however, in wartime, if there's any chance that you would actually be called out as a militia to defend yourself or fight, you wanted a good old veteran in charge, somebody whom you respected. But apparently, this was work as the Middlesex County Lieutenant Colonel. That's about the only official job that Thomas Oliver took on in his first 40 years. In 1774, with the Massachusetts Government Act, the Parliament decided to limit Massachusetts government even more. They were requiring town meetings to take place only once a year to elect new officials unless you had the governor's permission. The council, instead of ultimately being elected from the bottom up, now they were all going to be appointed from the top down. The result, because these men were summoned to meet with the governor by writ of mandamus, was called the Mandamus Council, or for the local newspapers, the Newfangled Council. The Massachusetts Government Act arrived in Boston in August 1774, and along with it came some special news for Thomas Oliver. Back in March, Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver had died, and the ministry had decided to appoint Thomas Oliver to succeed him. This was a surprise for everyone, probably mostly for Thomas Oliver. Because as I said, he had not been politically active, he had not held public office, he hadn't run for office, he hadn't written essays, he hadn't tried to get royal appointments, and yet here was his name on this big commission from London as Lieutenant Governor. Some speculated that his name had been written in by mistake, and London really had in mind Peter Oliver, who was Andrew's brother, and was politically active. He was in fact the Chief Justice of Massachusetts at the time. Or maybe they didn't, it wasn't, the mistake wasn't that they simply wrote in the wrong name, maybe they just assumed that Thomas Oliver might be like the third brother, and so we should bring him along. Yet another newspaper suggested that Thomas was appointed as a favor to his cousin, I think a distant, a second cousin or something, Richard Oliver, who was an alderman and member of Parliament in London. However, Richard Oliver was one of the very few members of Parliament to vote against the Boston Port Bill, so the government in London had no reason to give him any favors at all. But in any case, however it happened, on August 8th, Thomas Oliver went to Salem, he met with Governor Gage, and he was sworn in as a lieutenant governor and a member of the newfangled council. Elizabeth's uncle Williamrattle was also summoned to the council by writ of mandamus, but he kept away, knowing it would be unpopular, not being interested in politics. And indeed, at this time, as the governor was trying to summon these new councilors, there were crowds in the western counties stopping the men from going. Or if they had signed, sworn in and gone back home, they would surround the houses with hundreds of people and yell and scream until they talked about resigning. Way out in the west, the really radical action started out in the Berkshires. Men were mustering in their militia companies, hundreds of men surrounding the courthouse during court sessions and refusing to let the judges hold any sessions under the Massachusetts Government Act. So that was this atmosphere in late August 1774 when this man wrote to General Gage. This was Williamrattle. He was in his late 60s. He was a general of the Massachusetts militia. He lived along the Watertown Road, closer to the center of Cambridge. And on August 27th, he wrote a letter from Cambridge to the governor. Mr. Brattle presents his duty to Governor Gage. He apprehends it his duty to acquaint His Excellency from time to time with everything he hears and knows to be true, and is of importance in these troublesome times, which is the apology Mr. Brattle makes for troubling the general with this letter, blah, 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 blah. And he finally got around to a report on the Powder House in Charlestown. This was a building that held gunpowder for town militia companies, for the province, even for individuals. If you didn't want gunpowder hanging around your barn, you could take it into the Powder House. And finally, Brattle's letter ended, "This morning the selectmen of Medford came and received their town stock of powder, which was in the arsenal on Quarry Hill, so that there is now therein the king's powder only, which shall remain there as a sacred depositum, till ordered out by the Captain General, by Gage, to His Excellency General Gage, etc., etc., etc." So at the end of August, General Gage decided to make sure that gunpowder and any other weapons that he could have couldn't be used against his soldiers in Boston. As Boston merchant John Andrews wrote on the yesterday in the afternoon, 280 men were drafted from the several regiments on the common, furnished with a day's provision each to be in readiness to march in the morning. A sufficient number of boats from the men of war and transports took them on board from Long Wharf, which sticks out here, between 4 and 5 o'clock this morning, and proceeded up Mystic River, landed them at the back of Bob Temple's house, from whence they proceeded to the magazine. The soldiers met Sheriff Phipps, who had received orders from Gage through Brattle to open the gunpowder house for them. The soldiers waited outside the gunpowder house until the sun came up, because you really don't want to go into a gunpowder house with a lantern. They then removed 250 half barrels of powder onto 8 wagons. And as Thomas Newell's diary added, a detachment from this corps went to Cambridge and brought off 2 field pieces. About 20 soldiers went into the center of Cambridge and took 2 small cannon that the Middlesex County militia had to train with. Some locals in the center of town saw what was going on. They wanted to stop it, but they couldn't get organized enough to face up to armed soldiers. The soldiers moved all this ordnance back to Castle William, what's now Castle Island. Back then it really was an island, now it's not. That fort was occupied by the British Army. It was totally under the royal control, beyond the reach of any locals. Rumors in Boston said that Lieutenant Governor Oliver had helped in this operation, but he never mentioned that, so I think those rumors were likely mistaken. The operation took fewer than 300 soldiers over by midday. General Gage was pleased because he thought he had regained the upper hand. However, to the populace, to the people of Massachusetts, the removal of the powder and cannon looked like a strike at their militia, yet another branch of their self-government being encroached on, like the town meetings, like the council, like the courts. So the populace rose up, and not because of any orders from their radical leaders or anything like that. In fact, Samuel Adams, their most important leader, was away in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress. The idea simply took hold with enough evidence that the royal government was taking away the community's rights, and those communities rose up in their crowd. Their first target was Williamrattle. As Merchant John Andrews wrote, the governor, walking up the main street in Boston to dine with Brigadier Piggott of the 43rd Regiment, who improves a house just above Liberty Tree, by chance or design, in pulling out his handkerchief, dropped a letter from Brigadier Brattle of Cambridge. So by the afternoon, from that letter, by the afternoon of September 1st, people knew that Brattle's letter had drawn Gage's attention to that powder house. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, no sooner did Brattle discover that his treachery had taken air than he fled, not only to Boston, but into the camp for safety. So he went all the way into Boston and into the army camp where he would be under protection of the soldiers. Brattle spent the next day writing a letter declaring he had never meant to anger his neighbors, but it was too late. He was never able to return to Cambridge again, and his house is now owned by the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. The same crowd that evening went out the Watertown Road to the house of Jonathan Sewell, the Royal Attorney General. The crowd surrounded this house, shouting for Sewell to come out. But in fact, he had already gone into Boston as well. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe he had heard that there was going to be trouble. Only his wife and little boys were home, along with some young men, probably recent Harvard graduates who seemed to have come by to help. And then there was a fight. There was a fight between those young men and a family slave and some of the crowd that were trying to force their way in the back door. One of the Harvard students referred to this as the argument baculinium, the argument of the club. One of the young men even fired a pistol inside the house, and that prompted the crowd outside to break a bunch of windows. But then it appears everybody realized that they were about to go too far. And the young men went out and said, yes, they had shot a pistol, but it was a total accident, no one was hurt. And the crowd said, okay, in exchange for some wine, we won't go bother anyone else tonight in this neighborhood. And so they got wine and the evening ended. However, rumors were spreading and getting worse. In Shrewsbury, people heard the powder was taken, 6 men killed. In Hartford, people heard Brattle at Cambridge, a high Tory, had petitioned Gage for troops to protect him at his house. A mob gathered and demand of Brattle to renounce his Toryism, but after a short parley, the troop fired, killed some right out, and a large number wounded. By the time the alarm reached Longmeadow, Massachusetts, it was that the ships in the harbor of Boston and the army on the land side were also firing upon the town. So it was like the town was demolished. Men started to gather in their militia companies. This is the armed branch of those communities. This is how the radical Boston Gazette spun the story the next Monday. From these several hostile appearances, the county of Middlesex took the alarm, and on Thursday evening, the 1st, began to collect in large bodies with their arms and provisions and ammunition, determining to, by some means, to give a check to the power which so openly threatened their destruction and in such a clandestine manner robbed them of the means of their defense. John Andrews wrote, they had an account at Marlborough of the powders being removed last Thursday night, yet they were down to Cambridge, which is 30 miles, by 8 o'clock Friday morning, with a troop of horse and another of foot. And when those hundreds of men started to come into Cambridge from the west, they passed by Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver's house. He wrote, early in the morning on the day, a number of the inhabitants of Charlestown called at my house to acquaint me that a large body of people from several towns in the county were on their way, coming down to Cambridge, that they were afraid of some bad consequences might ensue, and begged I would go out to meet them and endeavor to prevail on them to return. So local men, town officials, or members of the town committee of correspondence, or possibly both, were trying to keep the peace. They assumed that the people coming in would listen to a high-ranking gentleman, even one who was politically opposed to them. Oliver said, "In a very short time, before I could prepare myself to go, they appeared in sight. By then the crowds had realized that there had been no shooting, Boston was not in flames, there were not dead people anywhere. They had left their firearms, etc., at some distance behind them, in Watertown and in a yard near the town border, under guard, and they advanced to Cambridge, some armed only with sticks." Oliver says, "I went out to meet them and asked the reasons of their appearance in that manner. They respectfully answered, they came peaceably to inquire into their grievances, not with the design to hurt any man. I perceived they were the landholders of the neighboring towns, and was thoroughly persuaded they would do no harm." Oliver believed that these men, as men of property, men who owned their own farms, were respectable and were not going to cause trouble. Oliver said he spoke to them in such a manner as I thought best calculated to quiet their minds. They thanked me for my advice, said they were no mob, but sober, orderly people who would commit no disorders, and then proceeded on their way. The crowd began to assemble on the town common, which was considerably larger than it is now. It was lined with elm trees for shade, surrounded by houses and buildings. This is a map a Harvard College student from a few years later from the Harvard Archives. John Andrews wrote, "At 8 o'clock there were about 3,000 there under their regular leaders on Cambridge Common, and continually increasing." These meant under their regular leaders, that meant under their militia officers. So there were now, each company chose 1 or 2 men to form a committee of the body to represent the whole group. So now there were 2 sets of committees. There were the local committees, and there were the committees of these men from the countryside. The crowd insisted they were there to hear from 2 members of the newfangled council who lived in Cambridge. They wanted to hear resignations, like those crowds to the west. One of those men lived out here on the Watertown Road, Elizabeth Oliver's uncle Joseph Lee. He was 63 years old. He was now a local judge. That morning a man from Lexington had warned him about the crowds coming, and he immediately sat down and wrote out a resignation from the council. The other man was Samuel Danforth, 77 years old. He had been on that council for 35 years, more than half his adult life. He was a very learned gentleman. His learning included alchemy. At one point he wrote a letter to Benjamin Franklin saying that he was about to discover the Philosopher's Stone. If you've read Harry Potter, you know that that Philosopher's Stone is the secret for eternal life. And so Franklin wrote back and said he looked forward to discussing this more and discussing how American liberties were secure 100 years from now. Danforth had actually tried to resign from the council the day before, but the governor had refused to accept his resignation. So neither of these guys was really going to be putting up any resistance. The committee sat down with the 2 gentlemen in Lee's house to discuss how the situation could be resolved so that everyone was satisfied, no one was hurt. But there was now a new worry. How would General Gage react to this assemblage of people, these thousands of men building up in the next town? A report arose that the troops were on their march from Boston. So the local leaders went back to Lieutenant Governor Oliver. Oliver said, "I was desired to go and intercede with His Excellency to prevent their coming. From principles of humanity to the country, from a general love of mankind, and from persuasions that they were disorderly people, I readily undertook it." So he agreed to go into Boston. He traveled east past the Lee House, the Sewell House, the Brattle House. On the common, Oliver saw the crowd. "As I passed the people, I told them of my own accord I would return and let them know the event of my application." He hurried through Charlestown to the ferry across the Charles to Boston, and along the way, he met another committee, a committee of the Boston Radicals. A warning had come to Dr. Joseph Warren, a young physician. He later wrote to Samuel Adams, "A billet was brought requesting me to take some step in order to prevent the people from coming to immediate acts of violence. Its incredible numbers were in arms and lining the roads from Sudbury to Cambridge. I summoned the Committee of Correspondence, but as care had been taken to caution every man who passed the ferry from alarming Boston, I judged it best not to inform the person who warned the committee of the business that they were to meet upon. They therefore made no great haste to get together. After waiting some time, I took as many of the members as came my way to Charlestown, fearing that something amiss might take place. So Warren went out with 5 other Boston organizers. For years, the royal officials had blamed the Boston radicals for riling up people in the town and riling up the people in the countryside, causing troubles, inflaming little grievances into big constitutional issues. But this committee was on its way out to Cambridge to try to calm the crowd. Oliver and the Boston officials all realized they all wanted a peaceful end, so they all wished each other success, and they went on their way. In Boston, the Lieutenant Governor went to the Province House, which is the residence for the Royal Governor near Old South Meeting House. He met with General Gage. He also, we know, met with Admiral Samuel Graves, the head of the Royal Navy contingent in town. The Boston Gazette later credited Oliver for telling the Admiral that the people in Cambridge were not a mad mob, but the freeholders of the county. General Gage said he hadn't ordered any soldiers out against the crowd. After their conversation, after hearing from Oliver, he wasn't going to order any soldiers. So Oliver turned around and headed home, back across the ferry. He reached the Cambridge Common again in mid-afternoon. Judge Danforth had announced his resignation, saying it was a great mortification of him to find the step lately taken by him so disagreeable to his country, in which he conscientiously had meaned to serve them. And Judge Lee had read out his resignation letter, and he also assured the crowd that they were behaving well, they were respectful to him. They were a respectable crowd themselves. This is a sort of public ritual in these sorts of protests, the elite showing respect for the people and vice versa. The Boston organizers had arrived and tried clumsily to calm the people who were already pretty calm. One of them had decided to treat the gathering as a town meeting. As the Boston Gazette reported, upon this a vote was called for to see if the body was satisfied with the declarations and resignations, and passed in the affirmative nem. Con, which is abbreviation for no dissenting. It was then moved to show whether the body would signify their abhorrence of mobs, riots, and the destruction of private property. And that passed in the affirmative, nem. Con. So like 4,000 men with clubs saying, oh yeah, we're totally against Borland. There were still some issues for the committees to discuss. The Boston men asked the crowd to choose leaders to meet with them. Of course, the crowd already had chosen their leaders that morning, and so the Bostonians were out of touch. There was still this social gap between the city, or the port town, and the countryside, between gentlemen and ordinary farmers, but everyone sort of accepted this. The committees, the chosen gentlemen, went into a tavern to dine and confer, while the thousands of other men sort of stood and sat out on the common, waiting to see what would happen. Some stood under the tree that later became known as the Washington Elm. It got that name because George Washington supposedly took command under it, which he didn't do. But if Cambridge wants to commemorate this elm, I think this gathering in September 1774 is more significant. It caused more change, but it is bottom-up democracy rather than top-down military hierarchy that it would commemorate. After the dinner, the crowd heard an apology from Sheriff David Phipps, not for turning over the militia gunpowder and the cannon, but the gentleman had decided that he had been following military orders to do that, so he had to. But he had to apologize for sending out court writs under the Massachusetts Government Act. And likewise, the county clerk apologized for sending out such writs and resigned. So basically, the Middlesex County courts were stymied. Around then, Lieutenant Governor Oliver arrived back with his good news that no troops were on the way, things were looking good. Oliver wrote, I was then thanked for the trouble I had taken in the affair, and I was just about to leave them to their own business, when one of the committee observed that as I was present, it might be proper to mention a matter they had to propose to me. It was that although they had a respect for me as Lieutenant Governor of the province, they could wish I would resign my seat on the council. Oliver reproached them for adding a condition to their deal. He argued that the Crown had appointed him as Lieutenant Governor under the old Constitution, not the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Lieutenant Governor traditionally did sit on the council. He argued that the thousands of men waiting there actually represented only one county, and he answered to the whole province. Ultimately, they decided, okay, he said, okay, it becomes absolutely clear that the whole province is opposed, I will resign from the council. And they said, all right, this, according to the Boston Gazette, this seemed satisfactory to the committee, and they were preparing to deliver it to the body. The gentlemen were sure that they would be able to present the deal that they had made to the crowd, and it would be accepted. At that point, the situation seemed to have been resolved. And then, by coincidence, the commissioners of customs rode by on their way from Boston from Salem, where they had moved when General Gage moved the government. Now, these were the high-level gentlemen who were in charge of collecting all the taxes since 1767. These were some of the most unpopular officials in North America. And one of the most unpopular of these unpopular officials, Benjamin Hallowell Jr., was riding by in a coach. The farmers from the inland towns probably didn't recognize these customs officials who worked on the coast. But Isaiah Thomas, the printer of the Massachusetts Spy in Boston, he was there on the common and he pointed out Hallowell. Specifically, Hallowell later reported, "No insult or affront was offered me until I came to where some people from Boston stood, who called to me, 'Damn you, how do you like us now, you Tory son of a bitch?' The sight of that obnoxious person," said the Gazette, "so inflamed the people that in a few minutes above 160 horsemen were drawn up and proceeding in pursuit of him on the full gallop. The committee man ran around trying to stop the people from chasing away. A few continued after Hallowell across the bridge from Cambridge, through Roxbury, all the way to the gates of Boston." Henry Holton, one of the customs commissioners, not one being chased, later wrote, "Mr. Hallowell narrowly escaped being taken. He happened to have a brace, two pistols. The cry was, 'Stop him! He has killed a man!' And when the chase grew warm, he got out of his chaise on his servant's horse, and with a pistol in each hand, kept the people off and got safe to the guard in Boston." Back in Cambridge, people were now worried about the soldiers again. Would Hallowell ask General Gage to send out the troops now? The leaders sent out light horsemen to scout the roads, men on horseback, but they were using the term light horsemen, which is a military term, so they were seeing this as a military maneuver. Thomas Oliver took the opportunity to head back to his house. "I chose to get out of the way. I was just going into my carriage to proceed to Boston when a vast crowd advanced, and in a short time my house was surrounded by 4,000 people, and 1/4 part of them in arms. Some of the men had gone back to get their guns. I waited in my hall when 5 persons entered, with a decent appearance, who have informed me that they were a committee from the body of the people to demand my resignation as a councillor. The crowd had replaced their leaders with more confrontational men. The new committee had brought a paper for Oliver to sign. It called the Massachusetts Government Act a manifest infringement of the charter rights and privileges of this people. It ended with Oliver promising to resign from the council. Oliver reproached these visitors for ingratitude and false dealings. He reminded them that he had a deal with their colleagues. But these men answered, the people were dissatisfied with the votes of the committee in the morning. An Irish businessman arrived outside at the time and he assessed the crowd. He judged that those drawn up regularly in lines were about 2,000 and that the bystanders were, I think, 1,000 more. There was no tumult, but an awful stillness, silence through the lines and amongst the surrounding body of people. All was negotiated by the committee, but in the presence of the body, the committee communicating by the officers the information through the lines so that all would know what was transacted. And those negotiations, they were not going well. And Oliver absolutely refused to sign any paper. The men warned of the consequences of refusing the demands of an enraged people. Some men were pressing through the gate into the yard onto Oliver's property. Oliver saw people pressed up against my windows, which were then open. He could hear men in the back of the crowd crying for vengeance against the foes of their liberty. The committee started to appear anxious. They endeavored to appease the people, but in vain. Oliver heard the distresses of my wife and children upstairs. He made a wild suggestion. I proposed that the people should take me by force. The committee was startled and said, no, you do not want to do that. Finally, after a long negotiation, Oliver surrendered to a point. He took the piece of paper, he added one line at the bottom. My house at Cambridge being surrounded by about 4,000 people in compliance with their command, I signed my name. The committee took that document out to the assembly. The Irishman said it was immediately handed along the lines and read publicly at proper distances till the whole body of the people were made to hear it, prompting a cheerful murmur or general universal voice of joy. But Oliver said the committee found great difficulty in getting it accepted. I had several messages that the people would not accept it with those additions, upon which I walked into the courtyard and declared that I would do no more, that they should put me to death. I perceived that those persons who formed the first body, which came down in the morning, consisted of the landholders of the neighboring towns, used their utmost endeavors to get the piece of paper received with my additions, but were still not able to protect me from the other insults which I received from those who were in arms. Only one force was strong enough to resolve this situation. According to John Tudor's diary, at 5 p.m. came on hard thunder and lightning with a great shower. And so as it rained heavily, everyone decided it was time to go home. Thousands of men went back to their taverns and back to their farms. That night, Oliver sent General Gage a letter begging him not to send troops, or it would prove fatal to him. And the next day, Oliver was back in Boston to stay, and his family came with him soon after. Brattle and Sewell were already in Boston when the Olivers came. A few days later, John and Elizabeth Vassall moved into town with their children. On September 16th, Judge Lee secured a certificate from the Charlestown Committee of Correspondence that he was going on a tour through the country for his lady's health. And the committee said that the people should treat him with such civility and respect as shall do honor to our common cause. So he was getting out of town as well. In October, George Ruggles made a deal with a Bostonian named Thomas Fairweather. They basically traded houses. Ruggles moved into Fairweather's house in Boston, and Fairweather moved into Ruggles' house out in Cambridge, and that is why that is now called the Ruggles-Fairweather house. I'm not sure when the Borlands and Penelope Vassall moved out, but the owner of all those houses but Fairweather were out of town when the war began. The only people left were the servants. And those changes reflected the new reality in Massachusetts. Supporters of the royal government no longer felt safe in the countryside. The authority of the royal government now stopped at the gates of Boston. General Gage had troops in Boston, he had troops at Castle William, he had no power to enforce the law anywhere else in Massachusetts. The rest of Massachusetts, and in fact the rest of New England, had risen up. It was effectively free of British authority, British rule, from September 1774 on. In October, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress convened. This is a prohibited legislature, but it assumed the powers of taxation and military preparation. It became the de facto government for all of Massachusetts except for Boston. What happened from September to April is the subject of my new book, The Road to Congress, which will be published later this spring, and it has a lot more stories to tell. But let's go back to Thomas Oliver. He never returned to that big house in Cambridge. After General Gage returned to England in the fall of 1775, Oliver officially became acting governor of Massachusetts. But General William Howe was really in charge because Boston at that point was under martial law. Oliver presided over a couple of meetings of the Bandits Council in Boston, and then they all sailed away in March 1776 when the British Army evacuated the town. Thomas Oliver settled in England, still wealthy from his plantations. Eventually his first wife Elizabeth died, he remarried, he had a comfortable life in the English countryside, and he continued to receive his salary as lieutenant governor until he died in 1815. So he served about a month as lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, a year and a half as lieutenant governor of Boston, and almost 40 years as royal lieutenant governor in name only. In 1873, local historian Samuel Adams Drake published a book called Historic Fields and Mansions of Middlesex, and he applied a new name to the Olivers' old neighborhood, Tory Row. It was a nostalgic name for a place that had come to an end almost overnight, 99 years before. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Yes, sir.
My understanding is that Elmwood is owned by Harvard and is the residence of the president. At least Larry Summers lived here. I don't know about Faust. Have the Harvard students discovered that Elmwood was built with slave labor, that it was tended by the money to establish it came from these plantations, and why have they not said anything about it?
It's an interesting question. Well, let's see. Yes, it is the resident. It is the residence of the Harvard president. And last year, when I was doing a walking tour and standing in the driveway with a dozen people, this very nice white-haired couple came through. I realized, oh, hello, President's House, thank you, excuse us, let's get out of your driveway here. As I understand it, the President used to live closer to Harvard Yard, and then came 1968. And so that's why they decided to take this mansion, which the university already owned, and make it the place where the President lived. There are, I showed a picture of the Apthorpe House, which is where the Borlands live. That is actually inside one of the Harvard, what do they call it, houses. And that was also from Caribbean slave labor. A lot of these houses, of course, some owned by Harvard, some by the government, the federal government, are based on Caribbean slave labor. It's a question, when we look at it compared to, say, the Harvard Law School Shield, which was recently changed because it was based on this heraldry of the Ryle family. That was set up as a way to honor Mr. Ryle or thank him. Whereas these houses, we do benefit from them, but I think the universities are actually on the forefront of acknowledging that debt, or at least acknowledging the history. And I don't know what they can do otherwise. The Ryle House has now changed its mission. It used to be the Medford Historical Society. It used to be another big, lovely Georgian mansion showing the lifestyle of the elite, all funded by these slave labor plantations. And it has now become the Ryle House and slave quarters, and they are doing their best through programming and through the emphasis of their extant slave quarters behind the house to show the full picture. And here we try to talk about the Vassal family that stayed. After John and Elizabeth Vassal and their children went into Boston, there was Tony and Coopa Vassal and their children still living here, but still legally enslaved. And they had a story of which we try to tell as part of the revolutionary tale as well. And there are further debates about what more can be done, but at least telling the story is what we can do as historians and historical sites. Yes, ma'am.
So when these families moved into Boston, did they already own houses in Boston, or was there housing available for them?
Some of them did. The Vassals, John Vassal owned a house in Boston. I think Thomas Oliver did as well. Some of the others weren't quite so rich, like Jonathan Sewell. I believe that he somehow got attached to the governor's staff, so he was getting a bit of income there. But it was seen as sort of an emergency, so people crowded where they could. Eventually, there was, the Ruggles Fairweather trade was a more formal trade, but there was sort of shifting around in a less formal way, especially among relatives.
Why would the Fairweathers want to come to Cambridge?
Well, that's an interesting question. One possibility is that because the port was closed, he didn't have mercantile business in Boston, so why not? But also within the English system, what you were supposed, the way you rose in society is your father worked with his hands until he was rich enough to send you to college, and then you worked as a professional or a merchant until you were rich enough to simply live off the land in the countryside and be a landed country gentleman. So I think that possibly the appeal was that he could come out here, have other people farm the land, and be a landed country gentleman in the British style. What he discovered when the war began, there's a wonderful story about him coming back and finding 3 companies of Connecticut soldiers in his house, the officers of whom were writing home saying, "We need soap." And the officer said, Mr. Fairweather was not pleased, but he couldn't do anything about it. So all these houses, when the actual war began, they were basically commandeered by the Continental Army for use as barracks and hospitals and other things. Yes, sir?
Why did the boundaries between Cambridge and Watertown get changed?
I have no idea. The question is, when does the boundary between Watertown and Cambridge change? And I can't tell you. I believe it.
It used to be sparse.
When you say used to be, was that 1600? 1960? I would have to look that up. I do know, we do know that, all of Arlington used to be part of Cambridge. When I spoke of the Powder House in Charlestown, well, that's now part of Somerville, and they're very proud of it. And so on. So a lot of these borders were changed for various reasons. Charlie, you know
I
this.
think at the time of the Revolution, the boundary was still at Spark Street.
Okay.
Meaning that Sewell, Leachmere Sewell House and the Lee House and further out was officially Watertown.
Interesting. Okay.
I think that it was sometime in the 1800s when it was actually moved up.
All right. Yes, sir.
I enjoyed your comments about the top-down versus bottom-up government, so really the middle up. And so my question actually, so for white property owners, any idea what percentage of the white males in Massachusetts were legally able to vote during that era?
It was actually pretty high. It was a majority of white males because the property, the value of property, either in land for most people or in business, was not that high. If you were independent, if you had your own business at all, if you were able to support yourself, then you were seen to be part of society and you were seen to have a vote in town meeting. A lot of poor people did not really participate in politics then or now.
Thank you. I guess that'd be a higher percentage than many other places around the nation. I suppose it's
That's
fair.
right. This was a more homogeneous and more egalitarian society than most parts of the British Empire, which was, the cause of all the trouble, wasn't it?
I think Judge Joseph Lee was the only one that was allowed back into his house, if I remember correctly.
He did come back after spending some part of the Revolutionary War in New Jersey, and he was in the house until he died. Penelope Vassal went with her son-in-law to one of the Caribbean islands, and then came back and was able to claim that being a woman, she was not involved in the politics of the war at all. How could she be? And therefore should not have her house confiscated. So those two houses remained in the property of the families. All the other houses, except for the Fairweather House, which is now legally Mr. Fairweather, were confiscated by the state. Oh, the Brattle House was not confiscated because Brattle's daughter stayed in the house, and she also made sure that during the siege of Boston, she had two pleasant young women living with her who were lovely hostesses for the officers of the army. And they became popular. They just won over people. Eventually one of these young women married Dr. John Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren's younger brother, and the other married a Harvard professor. But they simply made themselves made such good connections that the state never decided to confiscate Brattle's house.
And I believe this property became under the apothecary general of the...
Eventually, this was when the John Vassal house was confiscated. The first man to purchase it was a Newburyport merchant and who had made a lot of money in privateering and owned a great many houses, and then overextended himself, and he had to sell it to another man named Andrew Craigie, who was the apothecary general, the drug supplier, the pharmaceutical power for the Continental Army. And he was the man who extended the house back, rebuilt the estate. So the house, as we see it now, with the porches on either side and the general shape, was mostly the work of Andrew Craigie. Andrew Craigie also did a lot of real estate development in Boston, in Cambridge and Boston. He put in money for one of the bridges across the river. Very important man in building this community, and then he went bankrupt. And so the last years of his life, he was being hounded by creditors. And when he left the estate to his younger widow, she had to take in boarders. And among those boarders was Jared Sparks, the man behind Sparks Street, who was one of the first biographers or scholarly biographers of George Washington, and another professor was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. the first time he lived in this house. Yes, sir.
The idea of statehood, Massachusetts, there was no New Hampshire, is that right? I'm not sure.
When the Revolution began, New England consisted of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, which included Maine, and New Hampshire. New Hampshire was in conflict with New York over land which eventually became independent as Vermont. Later, during the early Republic, when one of these compromises, one of these many congressional compromises, brought in, I think, Missouri as a new slave state, the northern states got Maine as a new state, independent of Massachusetts, to balance off Missouri in the Senate. And that's how we ended up with 6 New England states instead of 4. Anyone else? Oh, thank you very much. I'll be happy to take